They handed me a nursing home brochure on Mother's Day and called it a gift. What they didn't realize was that this retired teacher had spent 30 years dealing with manipulative parents, and I was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Margaret Thompson, and at 68 years old, I thought I had earned the right to enjoy my golden years in peace. I had dedicated 3 decades of my life to shaping young minds at Elm Avenue Elementary School in Riverside, California, watching kindergartners blossom into confident 5th graders year after year. My classroom walls were covered with thank you cards from students who had gone on to become doctors, teachers, and parents themselves. I had touched thousands of lives, and in return, teaching had given me purpose, friendships, and a pension that allowed me to retire comfortably at 65. My ranch-style home on Elm Avenue had been my sanctuary since 1978, when my late husband Robert and I had scraped together every penny for the down payment. Back then, Riverside was still affordable for a young teacher and her electrician husband, and our little 3-bedroom house with its Spanish tile roof felt like a palace. Robert had spent weekends planting the citrus trees that now towered over our backyard, their branches heavy with lemons, oranges, and avocados that I still harvested each season. He had converted the garage into his workshop, where he built our kitchen table, our bedroom dresser, and the bookshelf that still held my collection of children's literature. When Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack 4 years ago, I thought my world had ended. We had planned to travel together, to visit those national parks we had always talked about, to spend lazy mornings reading the newspaper and tending our garden. Instead, I found myself alone in a house full of memories, learning to live as a widow after 41 years of marriage. But I discovered something surprising about myself during that dark period. I was stronger than I had ever imagined. Teaching had prepared me for solitude in ways I hadn't realized. After decades of arriving early to prepare lessons, staying late to grade papers, and spending summers planning curriculum, I knew how to structure my days meaningfully. I threw myself into volunteer work at the Riverside Community Center, helping other seniors navigate Medicare paperwork and teaching literacy classes to adult learners. I became more involved at St. Andrew's Methodist Church, where I had attended services with Robert every Sunday for nearly 4 decades. I joined the church council and organized the annual Christmas toy drive that had become the largest in our community. My 3 children had their own lives, their own families, their own concerns. Brian, my eldest at 43, lived in the suburbs with his teenage daughter after his divorce 3 years earlier. As an insurance claims adjuster, he had developed a methodical way of looking at everything in terms of risk and liability, including, I would later learn, his own mother. He visited once a month, usually on Sundays, always checking his phone and rarely staying longer than an hour. Our conversations were polite but distant, as if he were interviewing a client rather than spending time with the woman who had raised him. Jessica, my middle child at 40, had married her college sweetheart and moved to a gated community across town. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company and prided herself on her ability to present complex information in digestible formats. She had 2 teenagers, Tyler and Emma, who I adored, but saw infrequently as they became increasingly absorbed in their own social worlds. Jess visited more regularly than Brian, but our time together always felt scheduled and efficient, as if she were checking items off a to-do list. She would bring store-bought cookies and spend exactly 45 minutes discussing her children's achievements, her husband's latest promotion, and the general busyness of her life. Kevin, my youngest at 36, worked as a high school counselor and had always been the most sensitive of my children. He had married a lovely woman named Sarah, and they had 4-year-old twins who brought light into my life during their occasional visits. Kevin seemed to understand grief better than his siblings. perhaps because his work involved supporting teenagers through their own traumas and transitions. He called more frequently than the others, and sometimes brought the twins to help me harvest fruit from the backyard trees, watching with patient amusement as they climbed the lower branches with fearless determination. Despite their different personalities and life circumstances, my children had one thing in common. They worried about me living alone. Or at least, that's what they claimed. Their concern had intensified after my minor knee surgery the previous year, a routine procedure that required only a few days of recovery, but had somehow convinced them that I was becoming fragile and incapable. During my brief hospital stay, Kevin had presented me with papers to sign, explaining that they were temporary medical directives to help the doctors communicate with my family if anything went wrong during the operation. I had signed them without reading the fine print, trusting my youngest child as I had always done. The surgery had been completely successful, and my recovery had been swift and unremarkable. I was back to teaching literacy classes within 2 weeks and had resumed my regular volunteer schedule without any limitations. But something had shifted in my children's perception of me. They began asking more questions about my daily activities, expressing concerns about my driving, and making subtle suggestions about downsizing to something more manageable. I dismissed their worries as natural anxiety following their father's sudden death, assuming they simply needed time to adjust to seeing me as an independent widow rather than half of the married couple they had always known. My days had settled into a comfortable rhythm that suited me perfectly. I woke each morning at 6:30, a habit ingrained by decades of teaching schedules, and spent the first hour with my coffee and the local newspaper on my small front porch. The morning air in Riverside was crisp and clean, scented with jasmine, from the hedge that separated my property from my neighbor Susan's. I watched the neighborhood come alive as people left for work and children waited for school buses, feeling connected to the community I had served for so many years. After breakfast, I would tend to my small vegetable garden, where I grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs in raised beds that Robert had built during his retirement. The physical activity kept my joints flexible and my mind focused, and I took pride in the fresh produce that supplemented my meals throughout the growing season. I had learned to preserve the excess, filling my pantry with canned tomatoes and frozen peppers that would last through the winter months. Afternoons were reserved for my volunteer commitments or social activities. Monday and Wednesday mornings were spent at the community center, where I helped seniors understand their Medicare benefits and navigate the increasingly complex healthcare system. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons were dedicated to the literacy program, where I worked with adults who were learning to read or improving their English skills. Many of my students were immigrants who reminded me of the parents I had worked with throughout my teaching career, people who were determined to build better lives for their families despite significant challenges. Fridays were my personal time, often spent with Susan Palmer, my neighbor and closest friend since Robert's death. Susan was a widow herself, having lost her husband to cancer 2 years before Robert's heart attack. We had bonded over our shared experience of late-life loss and had developed a friendship that filled some of the loneliness in both our lives. We took turns hosting lunch, visited local museums and art galleries, and had established a weekly tradition of attending the Saturday farmers market in downtown Riverside. Evenings were quiet and peaceful. I prepared simple meals, often incorporating vegetables from my garden or fruit from the backyard trees. I read voraciously, working my way through the mystery novels and historical fiction that I had never had time to enjoy during my teaching years. I watched the news and stayed current with local politics, maintaining the engaged citizenship that I had tried to model for my students. Before bed, I would walk through the house, checking locks and turning off lights, pausing to look at the family photographs that covered nearly every surface. The walls of my kitchen were a timeline of my children's lives, from chubby-cheeked toddlers to graduation portraits to wedding photos. There were pictures of Robert teaching Brian to ride a bicycle, of Jess in her soccer uniform after winning the regional championship, of Kevin's high school graduation where he had been valedictorian. More recent additions showed my grandchildren at various ages, though I noticed that the newer photos were increasingly formal and distant, professional portraits rather than candid family moments. My bedroom still contained traces of the life I had shared with Robert. His reading glasses remained on his nightstand, though I had donated his clothing to charity months after his funeral. His workshop in the converted garage had become a storage area, but I had left his tools exactly as he had arranged them, unable to disturb the order that had made sense to him. Sometimes I would sit in his old chair and remember the sound of his humming as he worked on weekend projects, the smell of sawdust and oil that had clung to his clothes, the pride in his eyes when he finished building something with his hands. The house itself was showing its age, as houses do after more than 40 years, but it was still solid and comfortable. The roof had been replaced 5 years earlier, the plumbing updated when we had remodeled the master bathroom, and the electrical system upgraded to handle modern appliances. The exterior paint was beginning to fade, and some of the windows could use replacement, but these were maintenance issues that could be addressed over time rather than urgent problems that required immediate attention. My finances were stable and predictable. Robert's life insurance had paid off the mortgage completely, leaving me with a house that was entirely mine. My teacher's pension, combined with Social Security and the modest savings account that Robert and I had built over decades of careful budgeting, provided enough income to maintain my current lifestyle comfortably. I had no debt, no major expenses, and enough reserves to handle unexpected costs like car repairs or medical bills. My children knew I was financially secure, which should have eased their concerns about my independence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But instead of reassurance, my stability seemed to create a different kind of worry in my children. They began making comments about the responsibility of maintaining such a large property, the burden of home ownership, the advantages of community living where maintenance was handled by others. They spoke in the language of practicality and logic, but I sensed something else beneath their words, something that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The first concrete sign that something was changing came 6 months after my knee surgery, when Brian mentioned during one of his monthly visits that he had driven past Golden Valley Assisted Living and had been impressed by their facilities. He described the place as a resort-like community where residents could enjoy social activities and professional care without the stress of maintaining their own homes. His description was clinical and thorough, as if he had researched the facility extensively, though he presented it as casual observation rather than investigation. Jess had picked up the thread during her next visit, mentioning that several of her colleagues had moved their aging parents into similar communities and were amazed by how much happier and more social their parents had become. She spoke about the benefits of planned activities, nutritious meals, and the peace of mind that came from having medical professionals available around the clock. Her presentation was polished and persuasive, drawing on her marketing skills to highlight features and benefits rather than costs and limitations. Even Kevin, usually the most respectful of my autonomy, had begun making gentle suggestions about the advantages of simplifying my living situation. He spoke about the energy I could redirect from house maintenance to more fulfilling activities, the friendships I could develop with people in similar life circumstances, the security of knowing that help was always available if I needed it. His approach was more emotional than his siblings, focusing on my happiness and well-being rather than practical considerations. At first, I had dismissed these conversations as expressions of love and concern. It seemed natural that my children would want to protect me from the potential challenges of aging, and I appreciated their attention to my future needs. I assured them that I was managing my current life successfully and would consider their suggestions if my circumstances changed significantly. I thought I had made my position clear and that they had accepted my decision to remain in my own home for as long as possible. I was wrong. The real scope of their planning became apparent on the Sunday before Mother's Day, when all 3 of my children arrived together for what they described as an early celebration. I should have been suspicious of their coordination, since they rarely visited simultaneously and usually required weeks of scheduling to arrange family gatherings. Instead, I was delighted by the prospect of having all my children under one roof and had spent Saturday preparing for what I anticipated would be a wonderful family meal. I had risen early that Sunday morning to begin preparations, just as I had done for countless family celebrations over the years. I squeezed fresh orange juice from fruit picked from my own trees and prepared my famous lemon coffee cake, the recipe that had been my contribution to school bake sales and church potlucks for 3 decades. I set the dining room table with my good china, the wedding set that Robert and I had received as a gift and had used only for special occasions. I arranged fresh flowers from my garden in the centerpiece vase and polished the silver serving pieces that had belonged to my mother. The morning was beautiful, with clear skies and warm temperatures that promised a perfect spring day. I opened the windows to let in the fresh air and had soft music playing in the background, creating an atmosphere of celebration and welcome. I felt genuinely happy for the first time in weeks, anticipating the joy of having my entire family together for a relaxed meal and meaningful conversation. When my children arrived, they seemed unusually formal and focused, their conversation more stilted than the casual banter I had expected. Brian was wearing a suit despite the informal nature of our gathering, and both Jess and Kevin appeared nervous in ways that I attributed to their busy lives and the stress of coordinating their schedules. I served the meal I had prepared with such care, but noticed that they picked at their food and seemed distracted by something beyond our conversation. After we had finished eating, Jess reached into her purse and withdrew a gift bag decorated with pastel tissue paper. She presented it to me with a smile that seemed forced and a cheerfulness that felt rehearsed. "Happy early Mother's Day, Mom," she said, though her voice lacked the warmth I associated with genuine celebration. "We wanted to give you something special, something that shows how much we care about your future." I accepted the gift with the gratitude and excitement that I had always felt when receiving presents from my children, regardless of their age or the occasion. I removed the tissue paper carefully, as I had taught them to do when they were young, so that wrapping could be reused for other gifts. Inside the bag was a glossy brochure for Golden Valley Assisted Living, the same facility that Brian had mentioned months earlier, and that had somehow become a recurring topic in our recent conversations. The brochure was professionally designed, with photographs of smiling elderly residents engaged in various activities and testimonials from satisfied families. The cover featured an elegant dining room with well-dressed seniors enjoying what appeared to be a gourmet meal, and the interior pages highlighted amenities like a fitness center, library, and landscaped gardens. It was the kind of marketing material designed to make institutional living appear luxurious and desirable, and I realized immediately that considerable thought had gone into selecting this particular presentation. I looked up from the brochure to find my 3 children watching me expectantly, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and anxiety that I had seen countless times during parent-teacher conferences when discussing difficult topics. The silence stretched uncomfortably as I processed what had just occurred, the reality of their gift settling into my consciousness like a stone dropped into still water. "This is my Mother's Day present?" I asked, my voice steady despite the shock that was beginning to spread through my chest. "A brochure for a nursing home?" "It's not a nursing home, Mom," Brian said quickly, his insurance adjuster training evident in his immediate attempt to control the narrative. "It's an assisted living community, and it's one of the finest facilities in the region. We've done extensive research, and the reviews are outstanding." Jess leaned forward with the practiced enthusiasm of someone delivering a prepared presentation. "We thought you might be interested in learning about your options," she said, her marketing background apparent in her careful word choice. "The amenities are incredible, and the social opportunities would be perfect for someone with your interests and background." Kevin, always the most emotional of my children, reached across the table to take my hand. "We just want you to be happy and safe, Mom," he said, his counselor's training evident in his attempt to make the conversation about my feelings rather than their agenda. "We've been worried about you living alone, especially after Dad died and you had the surgery last year." I set the brochure down on the table with deliberate care, my teaching instincts helping me maintain composure even as my mind raced to understand what was really happening. 30 years of managing classroom crises had taught me to remain calm in unexpected situations, to gather information before reacting, and to maintain authority even when feeling uncertain or overwhelmed. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, looking at each of their faces in turn and noting the guilty acknowledgement that flickered in their eyes. "This isn't a spontaneous suggestion. This is coordinated and researched. You've obviously spent considerable time and effort on this presentation." The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't a gift, or even a suggestion. It was an intervention, carefully planned and orchestrated by my own children. The early Mother's Day celebration, the coordinated visit, the professional quality brochure, and their nervous energy all suddenly made sense. They hadn't come to honor me as their mother. They had come to convince me to abandon the life I had built and the independence I had maintained. As I sat at my own dining room table, surrounded by the good china and fresh flowers I had prepared to welcome my family, I began to understand that my children saw me not as a capable woman who had successfully navigated widowhood and retirement, but as a problem to be solved and a responsibility to be managed. The gift that should have celebrated my role as their mother instead communicated their belief that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions about my own life. The betrayal was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in concern and presented with love, but betrayal nonetheless. And as I looked at the glossy brochure that had replaced the flowers, books, or jewelry I might have expected for Mother's Day, I realized that my children had already decided my future without consulting me about my present. What they didn't know was that this retired teacher had spent 3 decades dealing with parents who underestimated both her intelligence and her determination. I had handled helicopter parents, manipulative parents, and parents who thought they could bully their way to getting what they wanted for their children. I had learned to read between the lines, to recognize hidden agendas, and to respond strategically rather than emotionally when faced with challenges to my authority. My children had made a serious miscalculation. They had mistaken my grief for weakness, my age for incompetence, and my love for them as willingness to surrender my autonomy. They were about to discover that the woman who had commanded respect from thousands of students, parents, and colleagues over 3 decades was not going to be dismissed or diminished by anyone, not even her own children. The war for my independence was about to begin, and I was far better prepared for battle than they could possibly imagine. Looking back now, I can see how perfect my life had become in the 4 years since Robert's death, though I didn't fully appreciate it at the time. There's something to be said for the rhythm of a well-ordered existence. The comfort of knowing exactly how your days will unfold and finding satisfaction in the simple accomplishments that fill them. My mornings began with the reliable ritual of brewing coffee in the same ceramic pot that Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. Its blue and white pattern now familiar enough that I could operate it in the pre-dawn darkness without conscious thought. The house itself had evolved into something uniquely mine during those years of solitary living. Where Robert and I had once compromised on decorating decisions, I now followed my own preferences completely. The living room walls, once painted, the neutral beige that he had preferred, now displayed a warm sage green that complemented the antique quilts I had inherited from my grandmother. I had rearranged the furniture to create better conversation areas and had added bookshelves to accommodate the growing collection of novels and gardening guides that filled my retirement hours. My garden had become a source of particular pride and accomplishment. The vegetable beds that Robert had built were now producing more abundantly than they ever had during his lifetime, perhaps because I had more time to tend them carefully, or perhaps because I had developed a better understanding of what thrived in our specific soil and climate conditions. The tomatoes I grew were legendary among my neighbors, and I had perfected a salsa recipe that was requested at every church, potluck, and community gathering. The citrus trees that Robert had planted decades earlier had matured into magnificent specimens that provided fruit for months at a time. I had learned to preserve the excess in ways that would have impressed my Depression-era grandmother, filling mason jars with marmalade and lemon curd that I gave as gifts throughout the year. The avocado tree had become so productive that I shared its bounty with everyone I knew, developing a reputation as the neighbor who always had perfectly ripe avocados available for anyone who needed them. My involvement in community activities had expanded significantly since retirement, filling the hours that had once been devoted to lesson planning and grading papers with meaningful volunteer work that utilized the skills I had developed over 3 decades of teaching. The literacy program at the community center had grown under my coordination, expanding from a small group of hesitant adult learners to a thriving program that served more than 40 students each semester. I had developed curriculum materials specifically designed for adult learning styles and had trained a team of volunteer tutors who shared my passion for helping people achieve their educational goals. The Medicare Assistance Program had become equally rewarding, though in different ways. Working with seniors who were struggling to understand the complexities of healthcare coverage reminded me daily of how fortunate I was to have maintained my physical and mental health well into my late 60s. I had developed a reputation for patience and clarity in explaining benefits and procedures, and the program director had asked me to train new volunteers in effective communication techniques for working with confused or frustrated clients. My involvement at St. Andrew's Methodist Church had deepened considerably since Robert's death, partly because I had more time available, and partly because the congregation had become a source of comfort and community during my adjustment to widowhood. I had joined the church council and had been elected to chair the outreach committee, overseeing programs that provided assistance to struggling families in our community. The annual Christmas toy drive that I organized had become the largest charitable effort sponsored by our church, collecting thousands of gifts for children whose families couldn't afford holiday presents. These activities provided structure and purpose to my retirement years, but they also offered something equally important: proof of my continued competence and value to my community. Every successful tutoring session, every grateful senior who finally understood their Medicare benefits, every family helped by our outreach programs served as evidence that I remained a contributing member of society rather than someone who needed to be managed or cared for by others. My social connections had shifted and evolved since Robert's death, but they had remained strong and meaningful. Susan Palmer had become my closest friend, and our weekly lunches and shopping expeditions provided the kind of companionship that helped fill the loneliness that sometimes crept in during quiet evenings. We had developed inside jokes and shared interests that reminded me of the friendships I had maintained with teaching colleagues over the years. Susan was intelligent, independent, and fiercely loyal, qualities that I valued more as I grew older and had less patience for superficial relationships. The neighborhood itself had changed somewhat over the decades, with younger families moving into houses that had once belonged to couples like Robert and me. I enjoyed watching the cycles of family life play out on Elm Avenue, seeing children grow up and move away while new babies arrived to take their place. Several of the young mothers had sought my advice about schools and child development, drawing on my professional expertise in ways that made me feel valued and respected, rather than simply tolerated as an aging neighbor. My financial situation had stabilized into something comfortable and predictable. Robert's careful planning and our decades of modest living had left me with resources that were more than adequate for my current lifestyle. The house was paid off completely, my teacher's pension provided steady monthly income, and the savings account that we had built together gave me security against unexpected expenses. I had even been able to increase my charitable giving, supporting causes that aligned with my values and interests without worrying about my own financial stability. Perhaps most importantly, I had developed a sense of personal identity that was separate from my roles as wife and mother. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based purely on my own preferences and priorities, rather than considering how those choices would affect a husband's career or children's. Schedules. I could eat dinner at 5 o'clock or 8 o'clock depending on my mood. I could spend entire Saturdays reading novels without feeling guilty about neglected household tasks. I could accept invitations to social events or decline them based solely on my own interest level rather than family obligations. This independence was precious to me in ways that I struggled to explain to my children when they expressed concern about my living alone. They seemed to view solitude as something to be avoided rather than something that could be chosen and enjoyed. They spoke about loneliness as if it were an inevitable consequence of widowhood, rather than understanding that I had discovered the difference between being alone and being lonely. Their own lives were so filled with constant activity and interaction that they couldn't imagine finding satisfaction in the quieter rhythms that had come to define my days. The distance between my children and me had developed gradually, in ways that seemed natural at first, but had become more pronounced over time. Brian's divorce had made him more withdrawn and cynical, less likely to engage in the kind of personal conversations that might have helped me understand his perspective on family relationships. His monthly visits felt increasingly obligatory, marked by polite inquiries about my health and activities, but lacking the warmth and genuine interest that had characterized our relationship when he was younger. Jess had become absorbed in the competitive social world of her suburban community, where success was measured by children's achievements and household acquisitions rather than personal fulfillment or community contribution. Her conversation focused almost exclusively on schedules and accomplishments, as if she were providing status reports rather than sharing her life with someone who loved her. I sometimes felt like I was talking to a pleasant stranger rather than the daughter I had raised to value kindness and authenticity above material success. Kevin remained the most emotionally available of my children, but his professional training as a counselor had created a different kind of distance. He spoke to me with the careful language of therapeutic intervention, analyzing my statements for signs of depression or cognitive decline, rather than simply listening to what I was trying to communicate. His concern was genuine and well-intentioned, but it felt clinical rather than personal, as if I had become a case study rather than his mother. The gradual shift in our relationships might have been easier to accept if it had happened suddenly, but the slow erosion of intimacy and understanding was more difficult to recognize and address. Each individual conversation seemed normal enough, but the cumulative effect was a growing sense that my children saw me as a responsibility to be managed rather than a person to be loved and respected. They asked about my physical health, but showed little interest in my emotional well-being. They inquired about my daily activities but seemed to miss the deeper satisfaction I derived from my volunteer work and community involvement. Their increasing focus on practical concerns had begun to feel invasive and patronizing. Questions about my driving abilities, suggestions about home maintenance tasks that might be too challenging for me to handle alone, comments about the advantages of simplified living situations. All of these topics had become recurring themes in our conversations, creating an undercurrent of tension that I found increasingly difficult to ignore. I had initially attributed their concerns to natural anxiety following their father's sudden death and my subsequent surgery. It seemed reasonable that they would worry about my safety and well-being, and I had tried to be patient with their repeated questions and suggestions. But as months passed without any decline in my capabilities or independence, their concerns began to feel less like love and more like assumption about my limitations based on my age rather than my actual circumstances. The suggestion that I might benefit from assisted living had been introduced so gradually and subtly that I hadn't recognized it as a campaign until much later. Brian's casual comment about Golden Valley's impressive facilities had seemed like innocent conversation at the time. Jess's stories about colleagues who had moved their parents into similar communities had appeared to be simple sharing of information. Kevin's gentle inquiries about whether I ever felt overwhelmed by household responsibilities had felt like caring concern from a son who understood the challenges of managing competing demands. But taken together, these seemingly separate conversations formed a pattern of persuasion that became more obvious in retrospect. My children had been building a case for institutional living without my awareness, gathering what they considered evidence of my need for additional support, while I remained focused on the many ways in which my life was successful and fulfilling. The disconnect between their perception of my situation and my own experience of my daily life had been growing for months without my full awareness. The coordination required for their Mother's Day presentation revealed the extent of their planning and the seriousness of their intentions. They had researched facilities, compared options, and selected what they considered the best available choice for my future living arrangements. They had synchronized their schedules to ensure that all three would be present for what they clearly viewed as an important family discussion. They had chosen their timing carefully, using a holiday that was supposed to celebrate motherhood as the occasion for suggesting that I could no longer manage my own life effectively. The sophistication of their approach was both impressive and insulting. They had applied the same careful planning and strategic thinking that they used in their professional lives to the challenge of convincing their mother to abandon her independence. Brian had approached the situation like an insurance claim, identifying risks and proposing solutions designed to minimize liability. Jess had treated it like a marketing campaign, researching the target audience and developing messages designed to motivate desired behavior. Kevin had used his counseling skills to frame the conversation in terms of emotional well-being and family relationships rather than practical necessities. What they had failed to consider was that their target audience was a woman who had spent 30 years developing exactly the same kinds of strategic thinking and persuasive communication skills that they were attempting to use against her. I had managed classrooms filled with children who tested boundaries and parents who challenged authority. I had served on school committees where competing interests had to be balanced and difficult decisions had to be made collaboratively. I had dealt with administrators who spoke in euphemisms and bureaucrats who hid their real intentions behind professional language. More importantly, I had learned to recognize the difference between genuine concern and manipulative behavior. Parents who were truly worried about their children's educational progress asked specific questions and listened carefully to responses. Parents who were primarily interested in getting their own way asked leading questions and dismissed information. That didn't support their predetermined conclusions. The conversation patterns I was seeing in my children's recent behavior fell clearly into the second category. The morning they arrived for our early Mother's Day celebration, I should have recognized the signs immediately. Their unusual formality, their nervous energy, their coordinated presence despite the logistical challenges of arranging simultaneous visits, all of these factors indicated that something significant was planned. But I had been so pleased by the prospect of having all my children together that I had overlooked the warning signals that my teaching experience should have made obvious. Their discomfort during the meal I had prepared with such care should have been another clear indication that they were focused on something other than family celebration. They picked at the food I had chosen specifically because I knew they enjoyed it, and their conversation felt stilted and artificial rather than relaxed and natural. They were clearly thinking about something else, something that was making them anxious and distracted in ways that prevented them from engaging authentically with the moment we were sharing. When Jess presented me with the gift bag containing the Golden Valley brochure, her body language and tone of voice communicated expectations that went far beyond normal gift-giving occasions. She was watching my reaction with the intensity of someone who had invested significant effort in achieving a specific outcome, not someone who was simply sharing a thoughtful present with her mother. The forced cheerfulness in her voice and the rehearsed quality of her presentation suggested that she had practiced this moment, perhaps with her brothers, in ways that reduced a spontaneous family interaction to a calculated performance. The brochure itself was clearly expensive and professionally produced, the kind of marketing material that required substantial investment to create and distribute. The photographs were carefully staged to present institutional living in the most appealing possible light, and the testimonials were selected and edited to emphasize benefits while minimizing any potential disadvantages. It was a sophisticated piece of persuasive communication, designed by experts who understood how to make difficult transitions seem attractive and desirable. But it was also deeply insulting as a Mother's Day gift. Instead of flowers that would celebrate my love of gardening, or books that would acknowledge my intellectual interests, or jewelry that would honor my role as the family matriarch, they had given me marketing materials for the place where they thought I should spend the remainder of my life. The message was unmistakable. They viewed me not as a person to be celebrated, but as a problem to be solved. The silence that followed my question about whether a nursing home brochure was really my Mother's Day present revealed their awareness that they had miscalculated. They had expected me to be grateful for their research and planning, to appreciate their concern for my future welfare, and to respond positively to their carefully prepared presentation. Instead, they were confronted with a woman who was clearly offended by their assumptions and their approach. Brian's immediate attempt to correct my characterization of Golden Valley as a nursing home demonstrated his recognition that they had lost control of the narrative. His insurance background had taught him the importance of precise language in avoiding unwanted implications, and he understood that the term nursing home carried connotations of decline and dependence that would work against their persuasive goals. But his correction also revealed his awareness that they were engaged in a sales presentation rather than a family conversation, and that their success depended on maintaining specific frames of reference rather than responding honestly to my concerns. Jess's follow-up about learning about options and exploring opportunities showed her marketing training in action, using language designed to make their proposals seem like expansion rather than limitation. She was trying to reframe institutional living as a positive choice that would enhance my life, rather than a necessary response to my declining capabilities. But her professional approach to what should have been a personal family discussion only emphasized the calculated nature of their intervention and their failure to understand what I actually wanted or needed. Kevin's emotional appeal about wanting me to be happy and safe was the most effective of their responses because it acknowledged the relationship dimension of their concerns, rather than focusing purely on practical considerations. His counseling experience had taught him to validate feelings and express care in ways that would be harder to dismiss than his siblings' more analytical approaches. But his reference to their worries about me living alone revealed that their campaign was based on their anxieties rather than any objective assessment of my actual circumstances. As I sat at my own dining room table, looking at the faces of the children I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, I began to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I had become during my years of independent widowhood. They were still seeing me through the lens of their childhood memories, when I had indeed been focused primarily on meeting their needs and supporting their father's career goals. They had never adjusted their perception to account for the woman I had become after their father's death. The woman who had discovered her own strength and built a meaningful life according to her own values and priorities. Their concern was real, but it was based on projection rather than observation. They were imagining how they might feel if they were suddenly alone at my age, without considering that I had had 4 years to adapt to solitude and had discovered that I actually preferred it to the compromises and accommodations that marriage had required. They were worried about challenges that I had already successfully navigated, problems that I had already solved, and limitations that existed in their minds rather than in my daily experience. More troubling was the growing realization that their motivations might not be entirely altruistic. The timing of their intervention, coming just as property values in our neighborhood had increased dramatically, suggested that they might be influenced by financial considerations as well as genuine concern for my welfare. The house that Robert and I had purchased for $35,000 in 1978 was now worth more than $500,000, representing a substantial inheritance that could be accessed more easily if I were living in a rental facility rather than maintaining ownership of real property. I had always known that my children would eventually inherit whatever assets Robert and I had managed to accumulate, and I had never begrudged them that expectation. But the possibility that they might be trying to accelerate that process for their own convenience rather than waiting for natural transitions was deeply disturbing. If they could convince me to move into assisted living, they could help me sell the house and manage the proceeds, gaining access to resources that were currently tied up in property that I was successfully maintaining on my own. The gift of a nursing home brochure on Mother's Day suddenly seemed like something more calculated and less innocent than misguided concern about my safety and happiness. It was beginning to look like the opening move in a campaign designed to separate me from my independence, my home, and ultimately my autonomy as an adult woman who had earned the right to make her own decisions about her own life. What my children didn't understand was that they had just declared war on someone who had spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this kind of battle. Every difficult parent conference, every challenging administrator, every bureaucratic obstacle I had encountered during my teaching career had been training for this moment. They had underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my willingness to fight for what I believed was right. The woman sitting at that dining room table, holding their insulting gift and listening to their patronizing explanations, was not the same woman who had once deferred to Robert's preferences and organized her life around their childhood schedules. I had been transformed by grief, strengthened by solitude, and empowered by the discovery that I was capable of far more than I had ever imagined during my years as a wife and mother. They wanted to treat me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. They had made the mistake of thinking that age automatically meant weakness, that widowhood necessarily meant vulnerability, and that love for them would make me willing to surrender everything I had built during my years of independence. They were wrong on all counts, and they were about to discover exactly how wrong they were. The battle for my future was about to begin with a force and determination that would surprise everyone involved, including myself. The words tumbled out of me faster than I could organize them, a flood of arguments and protests that I knew even as I spoke them were falling on ears that had already been closed to reason. I found myself explaining my daily routine in exhaustive detail, as if documenting my competence would somehow convince them that their intervention was unnecessary. I described my successful management of household finances, my active involvement in community organizations, my excellent health despite my age, and my clear thinking despite their apparent belief that I had become incapable of making rational decisions about my own life. I wake up every morning at 6:30 and read the newspaper cover to cover, I insisted, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm and rational. I balance my checkbook to the penny every month. I drive myself to volunteer commitments 3 days a week and have never had an accident or received a traffic citation. I maintain this house and garden without assistance from anyone except Mrs. Palmer's grandson who mows the lawn occasionally, and I pay him fairly for his time. I cook nutritious meals for myself. I take my medications exactly as prescribed. And I have passed every cognitive assessment my doctor has given me with flying colors. Brian interrupted my litany with the practiced patience of someone who had anticipated this exact response. "Mom, we're not questioning your day-to-day abilities," he said in the tone he probably used with difficult insurance claimants. "We're thinking about your long-term security and what might happen if your health changes unexpectedly. Dad's heart attack taught us that medical emergencies can happen without warning, and we want to make sure you have immediate access to professional care if you need it." The reference to Robert's death was a calculated emotional manipulation that made my anger flare even hotter. "Your father died of a massive heart attack at age 64, I replied sharply. "No amount of professional care would have saved him, and my current health bears no resemblance to his cardiac condition. My last physical exam was completely normal. My blood pressure is excellent, and my cholesterol levels are better than they were 20 years ago. You're not planning for my medical needs, you're planning for your own convenience." Jess leaned forward with her marketing-trained expression of sympathetic concern. "Mom, that's not fair," she said, her voice carefully modulated to convey hurt feelings rather than anger. "We've invested considerable time and energy in researching the best possible options for your future care because we love you and want what's best for you. Golden Valley has an excellent reputation, and the waiting list for their premium units is more than a year long. We've already submitted your application and paid the deposit to hold your place because we didn't want you to miss this opportunity." The revelation that they had already submitted applications and paid deposits without my knowledge or consent hit me like a physical blow. The scope of their presumption was breathtaking in its arrogance and terrifying in its implications. They had not only decided that I needed institutional care, they had already begun the process of arranging it without involving me in any aspect of the decision-making process. They had treated me like a minor child or an incompetent adult who could not be trusted with information about her own future. "You submitted an application for me without my permission?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "You paid money to an institution to hold a place for me without asking whether I wanted that place held? What gave you the authority to make financial commitments on my behalf or to represent my interests to a third party without my knowledge?" Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his counselor training apparently making him more aware than his siblings of the ethical problems with their approach. "We used the power of attorney you gave me after your surgery," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "The document gives us the right to make decisions about your care if we believe you're not able to make those decisions in your own best interests." The mention of the power of attorney documents that I had signed during my post-surgical recovery opened a door to understanding that I wished had remained closed. Those papers, which Kevin had presented to me as temporary medical directives to ensure that doctors could communicate with my family during my brief hospitalization, apparently contained much broader authority than I had realized or intended to grant. I had signed them while still groggy from anesthesia, trusting my youngest child to handle administrative details that seemed purely procedural at the time. "Show me those documents," I demanded, extending my hand with the authority I had once used to request homework assignments from reluctant students. "I want to see exactly what I signed and what authority you think it gives you to make decisions about my life without consulting me." Brian reached into the briefcase he had brought with him, producing a folder of legal papers that he handled with the careful attention of someone who understood their importance. The power of attorney documents were more extensive than I had expected, running to several pages of dense legal language that would have been difficult to understand under the best of circumstances, much less while recovering from surgery and dealing with the disorientation that follows general anesthesia. As I read through the provisions that I had unknowingly agreed to, the full extent of my children's legal authority began to become clear. The documents granted them broad discretion to make decisions about my medical care, my living arrangements, and my financial affairs if they determined that I was no longer capable of making such decisions in my own best interests. The language was carefully crafted to give them maximum flexibility while providing minimal protection for my autonomy or my right to disagree with their assessments of my capabilities. More disturbing was the realization that the documents had been prepared by an attorney rather than simply downloaded from an internet legal site. Someone had invested professional time and expertise in crafting language that would give my children extensive control over my life while making it difficult for me to challenge their decisions or revoke their authority. The legal fees alone would have been substantial, indicating that they had been planning this intervention for months rather than weeks. "When did you have these documents prepared?" I asked, looking up from the papers to study their faces for signs of guilt or acknowledgement. "These weren't created overnight, and you didn't write them yourselves. You hired an attorney to draft documents that would give you control over my life, and you presented them to me for signature while I was recovering from surgery and not in a condition to understand what I was signing." The uncomfortable silence that followed my question confirmed my suspicions about the timing and preparation involved in their legal maneuvering. They had used my temporary vulnerability following surgery as an opportunity to obtain signatures on documents that they had been planning to use for their own purposes rather than for my protection. They had taken advantage of my trust in them and my reduced capacity for careful decision-making to secure legal authority that I would never have granted under normal circumstances. "Mom, you're making this sound like some kind of conspiracy," Jess said, her marketing training evident in her attempt to reframe the conversation in less threatening terms. "We were genuinely worried about what would happen if you had complications from the surgery or if you needed someone to handle your affairs while you were recovering. Having legal authority to act on your behalf seemed like a reasonable precaution, and we never intended to use it unless there was a genuine emergency." But the carefully prepared brochure, the coordinated visit, the pre-submitted application, and the paid deposit all contradicted her claim that they had no intention of using their legal authority except in genuine emergencies. They had clearly been planning to use the power of attorney documents to override my preferences and force me into institutional living, regardless of my objections or my demonstrated competence to manage my own affairs. "If you never intended to use this authority except in genuine emergencies," I replied, "then why have you already used it to submit applications and pay deposits without my knowledge? What emergency required you to commit me to institutional living without my consent? What crisis in my daily life or my health status justified taking these actions without consulting me?" Kevin cleared his throat and attempted to answer with the therapeutic language he had learned in his counseling training. "Mom, we've been observing some concerning changes in your behavior and decision-making over the past few months," he said carefully. "Small things that might not seem significant individually, but that create a pattern of concern when viewed together. We've noticed that you sometimes forget phone calls or appointments, that you've been more isolated since Dad died, and that you seem to have difficulty accepting help even when it would be beneficial." The list of supposed warning signs that Kevin recited sounded like symptoms he had researched in professional literature, rather than observations he had made during our actual interactions. I could remember exactly which phone call I had forgotten to return, and it had involved a solicitation from a charity that I didn't support rather than an important personal or professional commitment. My so-called isolation was actually a carefully chosen social life that included meaningful activities and relationships rather than the superficial busyness that seemed to characterize my children's daily routines. My difficulty accepting help was actually a preference for maintaining my independence rather than creating unnecessary dependencies on others. "Kevin, those aren't symptoms of cognitive decline," I said, drawing on my own knowledge of child development and learning differences that I had acquired during my teaching career. "Those are normal variations in adult behavior that you're interpreting as pathological, because you've already decided that I need institutional care. You're seeing what you expect to see rather than what's actually happening, and you're using your professional training to justify decisions that you've made for other reasons." Brian interrupted with his insurance adjuster's focus on risk management and liability issues. "Mom, the real problem is that you're living alone in a house that's too big for you to maintain safely," he said, his tone becoming more authoritative as he moved into his area of professional expertise. "The stairs to the basement are steep and poorly lit. The bathroom fixtures are old and don't have adequate safety features. The kitchen appliances are outdated and could pose fire hazards. If you fell or had an accident, it could be hours before anyone found you, and the delays could be life-threatening." The catalog of supposed hazards in my own home was so ridiculous that I almost laughed, but I recognized the strategy behind Brian's presentation. He was creating a narrative of danger and vulnerability that would justify their intervention while making me appear foolish or stubborn if I disagreed with his assessment. But his list of hazards revealed more about his ignorance of my daily life than about any actual risks I was facing. "Brian, I've lived in this house for more than 40 years, I replied, making no effort to hide my exasperation with his manufactured concerns. "I know exactly where every step is located, which floorboards creak, and how long it takes for the hot water to reach each faucet. The basement stairs have railings on both sides and motion sensor lighting that I installed 2 years ago. The bathroom was remodeled after your father's death and includes grab bars and non-slip surfaces that exceed current safety codes. The kitchen appliances have been updated within the past 5 years and are covered by extended warranties that include annual maintenance inspections. More importantly, the suggestion that I might fall or have an accident and lie helpless for hours demonstrated their complete lack of understanding about my daily routine and social connections. I have more social contact in a typical week than many people half my age, I continued. Susan Palmer checks on me daily, either in person or by phone. I have volunteer commitments that would be noticed immediately if I failed to appear. I attend church services every Sunday, and at least a dozen people would be concerned if I missed without explanation. My doctor sees me quarterly for routine checkups, and his office calls to confirm appointments and follow up on any concerns. I am not isolated, I am not at unusual risk, and I am not in need of the kind of supervision that you're suggesting. The frustration in my voice was becoming more apparent as I realized that my logical arguments were having no impact on their predetermined conclusions. They had already decided that I needed institutional care, and they were simply trying to find justifications for decisions they had already made, rather than genuinely evaluating my current circumstances and capabilities. They were treating me like a child who needed to be convinced to accept adult decisions, rather than like an adult who had the right to make her own choices about her own life. Jess attempted to redirect the conversation toward what she probably thought were more persuasive emotional appeals. "Mom, we're not trying to take anything away from you," she said, her voice taking on the practiced sincerity that she used in her professional presentations. "We're trying to give you opportunities that you don't currently have. Golden Valley has a wonderful community of people your age who share similar interests and backgrounds. You could make new friends, participate in activities that are specifically designed for seniors, and have access to educational programs and cultural events that aren't available in this neighborhood." The suggestion that I was somehow missing opportunities for social connection and intellectual stimulation because I wasn't living in an institutional setting was particularly insulting, given the richness of my current volunteer work and community involvement. "Jess, I'm already surrounded by people my age who share similar interests and backgrounds," I replied. "I work with them every week at the community center and the church. I attend book clubs and gardening groups and volunteer training sessions, where I meet people who are engaged in meaningful activities rather than participating in programs designed to keep elderly residents occupied and manageable." But even as I marshaled arguments and evidence to contradict their assumptions, I was beginning to realize that this was not actually a debate or a discussion in which logic and evidence would determine the outcome. They had not come to my house to gather information about my preferences or to evaluate my current circumstances objectively. They had come to announce decisions they had already made and to convince me to cooperate with plans they had already set in motion. The power of attorney documents, the pre-submitted application, the paid deposit, the coordinated timing of their visit, all of these elements indicated that they viewed this conversation as a formality rather than as a genuine opportunity for me to influence decisions about my own future. They expected me to be grateful for their planning and to accept their conclusions about what was best for me, regardless of my own assessment of my needs and preferences. The realization that I was wasting my time trying to reason with people who had already closed their minds to alternative perspectives was both liberating and terrifying. It freed me from the obligation to continue making arguments that they were not listening to or considering seriously, but it also forced me to confront the reality that my own children were prepared to override my clearly expressed wishes about my own life if they believed it was in their best interest to do so. "You're not here to discuss this with me," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. "You're here to inform me of decisions you've already made and to convince me to cooperate with plans you've already implemented. You've decided that I need institutional care, you've selected the facility where you want me to live, and you've already begun the legal and financial processes to make it happen. The only question remaining is whether I'm going to cooperate, willingly, or whether you're going to force me to comply through the legal authority you obtained while I was recovering from surgery." The accuracy of my assessment was confirmed by their expressions and their silence. They had indeed expected me to be grateful for their intervention and to accept their decisions without significant resistance. They had underestimated my intelligence, my determination, and my willingness to fight for my independence, and they were now confronting the reality that their plan was not going to unfold as smoothly as they had anticipated. "Mom, it doesn't have to be adversarial," Kevin said, his counseling training evident in his attempt to de-escalate the tension that was building in the room. "We want what's best for you, and we believe that Golden Valley will provide you with a better quality of life than you can maintain living alone in this house. We're not trying to punish you or take anything away from you. We're trying to ensure that you have the support and security you need as you get older." But the word adversarial was exactly the right description for what was happening in my dining room that Sunday afternoon. My children had declared war on my independence, and they had chosen to fight that war using legal weapons that they had obtained through deception rather than through honest conversation about their concerns and my preferences. They had made themselves my adversaries by treating me like an incompetent person who could not be trusted with decisions about her own life. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side were my 3 children, united in their belief that they knew what was best for me and armed with legal documents that gave them broad authority to implement their decisions, regardless of my objections. On the other side was a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to deal with people who underestimated her intelligence, and who had no intention of surrendering her independence without a fight that would test every skill she had developed during her professional career. What they didn't realize was that they had just declared war on someone who had been preparing for this kind of battle her entire adult life. Every difficult parent conference, every bureaucratic obstacle, every attempt by others to diminish my authority or question my competence had been training for this moment. They had made the mistake of thinking that love for them would make me willing to sacrifice everything I had built during my years of independent widowhood. They were about to discover that the woman sitting across from them was not the same. Woman who had once organized her entire life around their needs and their father's career. I had been transformed by grief, strengthened by solitude, and empowered by the discovery that I was capable of far more than I had ever imagined during my years as a wife and mother, focused primarily on supporting others rather than asserting my own interests and priorities. The conversation was about to shift from discussion to warfare, and I was far better prepared for that kind of conflict than they could possibly imagine. The gentle, accommodating mother they remembered from their childhood was about to become their most formidable opponent, and they had no idea what they had just unleashed. The next morning at Golden Valley Assisted Living felt like waking up in someone else's nightmare. The institutional lighting, the antiseptic smell, and the beige walls seemed designed to drain hope from anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves imprisoned within them. I had spent the night in what they called a temporary accommodation unit while processing my admission paperwork. A sterile room with a narrow bed and furniture that looked like it had been purchased from a discount medical supply catalog. My children had executed their plan with military precision. Within 6 hours of our confrontation at my dining room table, they had transported me to Golden Valley with a single suitcase containing clothes they had selected, toiletries they had deemed necessary, and 3 photographs they had chosen to represent my entire life history. Everything else I had owned, everything that had made my house a home, had been left behind for them to sort through and dispose of according to their own priorities rather than mine. The admission process had been handled with the same calculated efficiency that had characterized their entire intervention. Brian had presented the power of attorney documents and the completed application forms, while Jess had used her marketing skills to charm the facility staff into expediting my placement, despite their claims about lengthy waiting lists. Kevin had focused on emotional manipulation, explaining to anyone who would listen how worried the family had been about my safety and how relieved they were to have found such an excellent care facility for their beloved mother. But as I sat in the common area that first morning, watching residents shuffle through their prescribed routines with the vacant expressions of people who had surrendered their autonomy along with their independence, I realized that my children had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that placing me in an institutional setting would somehow diminish my intelligence, my determination, or my ability to fight back against injustice. They had confused physical relocation with psychological defeat, and they had failed to understand that changing my address would not change my fundamental nature as someone who refused to be victimized by others. The other residents at Golden Valley initially seemed to confirm my children's expectations about institutional living. Many appeared to have accepted their circumstances with the resigned passivity that the staff clearly preferred and encouraged. They attended mandatory activities with forced enthusiasm, ate meals they had no role in planning, and followed schedules that had been designed for administrative convenience rather than personal preference. They had been transformed from independent adults into manageable clients whose primary function was to justify the facility's existence and validate their family's decisions to place them there. But as I observed more carefully over the following days, I began to notice that some residents were merely playing the roles that were expected of them while maintaining their authentic selves beneath the surface. They smiled during activities they found boring, expressed gratitude for services they didn't want, and participated in group discussions where their individual opinions were systematically ignored or redirected toward more acceptable perspectives. They had learned to survive institutional living by masking their true feelings and presenting themselves as satisfied customers rather than captive clients. It was during my third day at Golden Valley that I encountered Carmen Rodriguez, a 72-year-old former nurse who had been placed at the facility by her son and daughter-in-law after a minor fall in her apartment had been used as evidence that she could no longer live safely alone. Carmen had been observing me with the same careful attention that I had been paying to my new environment, and she approached me during what the staff called social hour, but what felt more like supervised recreation time. "You've got that look," Carmen said, settling into the chair beside mine with the confident movements of someone who had not been diminished by her institutional circumstances. The look of someone who's been screwed over by people who were supposed to love them and who's trying to figure out what to do about it. Her directness was refreshing after days of carefully modulated conversations with staff members who spoke to all residents as if they were children with cognitive impairments. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, grateful to encounter someone who seemed willing to engage in honest conversation rather than the therapeutic platitudes that characterized most interactions at Golden Valley. "Honey, I've been watching families dump their parents here for 2 years," Carmen replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen enough human behavior to have developed immunity to shock or surprise. "Most people either fight like hell for the first week and then give up, or they accept it immediately because they're too scared or too sick to resist. You're different. You're angry, but you're not broken, and you're planning something." Carmen's assessment was accurate enough to be both encouraging and unsettling. I was indeed planning something, though I hadn't yet formulated a specific strategy beyond my growing determination to escape from Golden Valley and reclaim control over my own life. But the fact that my intentions were apparent to someone who barely knew me suggested that I needed to be more careful about concealing my activities from staff members who were paid to monitor residents for signs of what they would undoubtedly classify as problematic behavior. "What gave me away?" I asked, curious about what signals I was sending that Carmen had been able to interpret so accurately. "You're still reading the newspaper every morning," she replied with a slight smile. Most people here gave up following current events within their first month because it reminds them of the outside world they're no longer part of. You're also asking questions about policies and procedures instead of just accepting them. And you're treating the staff like employees rather than authorities. You haven't been institutionalized yet. and that makes you dangerous from their perspective. Carmen's analysis revealed an understanding of institutional dynamics that could only have come from professional experience combined with personal observation. Her background as a nurse had given her insights into how care facilities operated, and her 2 years as a resident had provided her with detailed knowledge of how Golden Valley specifically managed its clients and their families. Over the following days, Carmen introduced me to Dorothy Williams, a 69-year-old former real estate agent who had been placed at Golden Valley by her nephew after her neighborhood had undergone demographic changes that he claimed made it unsafe for elderly residents. Dorothy possessed the sharp business mind that had made her successful in real estate sales, and she had spent her time at the facility analyzing the financial structure and operational methods that made Golden Valley profitable despite providing what she considered substandard services at premium prices. "They're making a fortune off our family's guilt and fear," Dorothy explained during one of our informal meetings in the facility's library, one of the few spaces where residents could have relatively private conversations without constant staff supervision. "The monthly fees are 3 times what it would cost to hire private assistants for people who actually need help. And most of the residents here don't need anything more than occasional social contact and basic household support." Dorothy's analysis of Golden Valley's business model revealed the economic incentives that motivated facilities like this to encourage family members to place their elderly relatives in institutional care rather than supporting them in maintaining independent living arrangements. The profits were substantial enough to fund marketing campaigns that promoted assisted living as a lifestyle choice rather than a necessity. And the legal structures were designed to make it difficult for residents to leave once they had been admitted. Carmen and Dorothy also introduced me to Ruth Kim, a 74-year-old retired librarian who had been managing her diabetes successfully for decades before her daughter decided that the condition required professional supervision and moved her to Golden Valley without consulting her about alternatives. Ruth possessed the research skills and attention to detail that had made her an excellent librarian, and she had been using those abilities to document the various ways in which Golden Valley failed to meet the needs and respect the rights of its residents. "They're violating federal regulations on patient autonomy and informed consent," Ruth explained, showing me a notebook filled with carefully documented incidents where residents had been denied information about their own care or prevented from making decisions about their daily routines. "The problem is that most residents don't know their rights, and their families don't want to hear complaints about the facilities they've chosen because it would force them to question their own decisions." The 3 women had been meeting informally for months, sharing information and supporting each other through the frustrations and indignities of institutional living. But they had never developed a concrete plan for challenging their circumstances or escaping from Golden Valley. They had been surviving rather than fighting back, adapting to their situation rather than working to change it. But my arrival seemed to catalyze their dissatisfaction into something more focused and potentially effective. "What you need to understand," Carmen told me during our 4th week of acquaintance, "is that your children used the legal system to trap you here, but the same legal system can be used to get you out if you know how to work it properly. The GAF, power of attorney documents they used have limitations that they probably don't understand, and there are procedures for challenging decisions that were made without proper consultation or consideration of alternatives." Ruth's research had identified several attorneys who specialized in elder law and had experience challenging inappropriate placements in assisted living facilities. "The key is proving that you're capable of independent living and that your family's concerns were not based on objective evidence of incapacity," she explained. "You need to document your current abilities, gather evidence about the circumstances under which you were placed here, and build a case that demonstrates your right to make your own decisions about where and how you want to live." Dorothy's business experience had taught her the importance of financial planning and resource management in any major life change. "You'll need money for legal fees, temporary housing, and establishing a new living situation," she said with the practical focus that had made her successful in real estate. But you also need to understand that your children will fight back if they realize you're trying to escape their control, especially if they've already begun making financial plans based on the assumption that you'll be permanently institutionalized. The revelation that my children might have financial motivations beyond genuine concern for my welfare was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. The house that Robert and I had purchased for $35,000 in 1978 was now worth more than $600,000, according to current market assessments, and my savings account contained nearly $250,000 that I had accumulated through careful budgeting and conservative investments over decades of teachers' pension contributions. They can't access your assets without your consent or a court order declaring you incompetent, Dorothy explained, drawing on her knowledge of real estate law and financial transactions. But they can make it very difficult for you to access your own money if they control your mail, your bank communications, and your ability to meet with financial advisors. The longer you stay here, the stronger their case becomes that you need their management and supervision. The urgency of my situation was becoming clearer as I understood more about the legal and financial implications of my placement at Golden Valley. Every day that I remained at the facility was being used as evidence that I needed institutional care. And every decision that my children made on my behalf was establishing a pattern of dependency that would be difficult to challenge if I waited too long to assert my independence. But the women who had become my allies at Golden Valley had also become my inspiration for something larger than individual escape. Carmen's nursing background had made her aware of how many elderly people were being poorly served by families who prioritized their own convenience over their parents' well-being. Dorothy's business experience had shown her the financial exploitation that often accompanied decisions to place elderly relatives in institutional care. Ruth's research skills had revealed the systematic violations of residents' rights that were occurring not just at Golden Valley, but throughout the assisted living industry. We could help other people who are trapped in situations like ours, Carmen suggested during one of our evening conversations. There are probably thousands of elderly people who have been placed inappropriately in facilities like this one, and most of them don't have the knowledge or resources to fight back effectively. The idea of transforming our individual struggles into a broader effort to protect elderly people from family exploitation and institutional abuse appealed to all of us as a way to find meaning and purpose in our current circumstances. We began to envision an organization that could provide legal assistance, advocacy services, and practical support to seniors who were being victimized by adult children or other relatives who prioritized their own interests over their elderly parents' rights and preferences. We could call it the Senior Advocacy Network, Ruth suggested, her librarian's instinct for organization evident in her immediate focus on structure and naming. We could provide information about legal rights, referrals to qualified attorneys, and support services for people who are trying to escape inappropriate placements or challenging family decisions that were made without their consent. The planning process gave us something to focus on besides our own frustrations and provided a framework for channeling our anger into constructive action. But it also made us more aware of the need to be careful about our activities at Golden Valley, since the staff would undoubtedly view our organizing efforts as disruptive behavior that needed to be discouraged or prevented. We began meeting in different locations within the facility and at varying times to avoid establishing patterns that might attract attention from staff members who were trained to monitor residents for signs of dissatisfaction or resistance. We developed a system of coded conversations that would sound like normal social interaction to casual observers, but that allowed us to share information and coordinate our activities without revealing the true nature of our discussions. The breakthrough in our planning came when Ruth discovered that one of her former library colleagues, Susan Palmer, lived in the same neighborhood where I had been forced to abandon my house. Susan had been concerned about my sudden disappearance and had been trying to locate me through my children, who had told her that I was receiving specialized care at an undisclosed location for my own privacy and protection. "Susan has been checking on your house every few days," Ruth reported after managing to contact her former colleague through a phone call that she had disguised as a request for research assistance. Your children haven't put it on the market yet, but they've been clearing out your belongings and making improvements that would increase its sale value. She's also been collecting your mail, which includes bank statements and other financial documents that you might need if you decide to challenge their authority. The information about Susan's activities provided both encouragement and urgency to our escape planning. It was reassuring to know that someone outside our immediate circle was concerned about my welfare and willing to provide practical assistance. But it was alarming to realize that my children were already making preparations to sell my house without waiting for my consent or even informing me of their intentions. "We need to move quickly," Dorothy advised, her real estate experience making her acutely aware of how rapidly property transactions could be completed once the decision had been made to sell. If they get the house on the market and start receiving offers, it will be much harder to stop the sale even if you can prove that they don't have the legal authority to proceed without your consent. Carmen's nursing background made her our expert on the practical aspects of leaving Golden Valley without triggering the kind of institutional response that could complicate our plans or endanger our safety. They have protocols for dealing with residents who try to leave without family permission, she explained. They'll contact your children immediately, and they might even call local law enforcement if they believe you're not capable of making rational decisions about your own welfare. The challenge was to develop a plan that would allow me to leave Golden Valley legally and safely, while ensuring that I had access to the resources and support I would need to establish independent living arrangements before my children could interfere with my plans or challenge my right to make my own decisions. Ruth's research had identified the legal requirements for voluntary discharge from assisted living facilities, which included demonstrating mental competence, arranging for appropriate housing, and ensuring access to necessary medical care. The facility can't legally prevent you from leaving if you can prove that you're capable of independent living and that you have adequate arrangements for your ongoing care and support, she explained. But the practical challenges were more complex than the legal requirements. I needed temporary housing while I worked to regain access to my own home, transportation to manage the various appointments and meetings that would be required to reestablish my independence, and financial resources to pay for legal assistance and living expenses during the transition period. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dorothy's real estate connections had led her to information about a network of temporary housing options specifically designed for seniors who were transitioning between living arrangements. There's a program in Sedona, Arizona that provides furnished apartments for elderly people who need time to establish permanent housing, she explained. It's operated by a nonprofit organization that specializes in helping seniors who have been displaced by family conflicts or inappropriate institutional placements. The idea of relocating to Arizona had several advantages beyond the availability of transitional housing. The distance from California would make it more difficult for my children to interfere with my activities or monitor my movements. The desert climate would be beneficial for the arthritis that had been bothering me more frequently since my placement at Golden Valley. And the Sedona area had a reputation as a community that welcomed people who were reinventing their lives and seeking new directions after major life changes. Arizona also has strong legal protections for elderly people who are challenging family decisions about their care, Ruth added, her research having revealed state laws that were more favorable to seniors' rights than the California statutes that my children had used to justify their intervention in my life. The decision to relocate to Arizona rather than attempting to return to my house in Riverside was difficult because it meant abandoning the community connections and familiar surroundings that had been such important parts of my independent life. But it also represented an opportunity to start fresh without the constant pressure of my children's disapproval and interference. Carmen, Dorothy, and Ruth all expressed interest in joining me in Arizona if the transitional housing program could accommodate all of us. We've all been displaced from our homes by family members who thought they knew what was best for us, Carmen observed. Maybe it's time to create our own family based on mutual respect and shared values rather than genetic relationships and guilt-based obligations. The prospect of building a chosen family with women who understood my circumstances and shared my determination to maintain independence was far more appealing than the prospect of continuing to battle with biological children who had demonstrated their willingness to override my clearly expressed preferences about my own life. The planning process took several weeks of careful coordination and discreet communication with contacts outside Golden Valley. Susan Palmer proved to be an invaluable ally, providing access to my financial records, facilitating contact with potential attorneys, and serving as a communication link between our group at Golden Valley and the support networks we were building in Arizona. The attorney we eventually retained, David Chen, specialized in elder law and had extensive experience challenging inappropriate assisted living placements. His initial assessment of my case was encouraging. "Your children exceeded their authority under the power of attorney documents," he explained during our first phone consultation, which Ruth had arranged through her library connections. "The documents grant them medical decision-making authority, but they don't provide legal authorization for placement in assisted living facilities without your consent, especially when there's no evidence of cognitive impairment or inability to live independently." David's legal strategy focused on proving that my placement at Golden Valley was not medically necessary and that my children had acted beyond their legal authority in arranging institutional care without my consent. He also advised us about the steps we would need to take to ensure that I could access my financial resources and make my own housing decisions without interference from my children. The escape itself was planned for a weekend when Golden Valley had reduced staffing and increased visitor activity that would provide cover for our departure. Carmen had identified a service entrance that was less closely monitored than the main reception area, and Dorothy had arranged for transportation that would take us directly to the airport for our flight to Arizona. Ruth had prepared documentation that proved our legal right to leave the facility voluntarily, and I had gathered the personal belongings that would be essential for reestablishing my life in a new location. Susan Palmer had agreed to continue monitoring my house in Riverside and to forward my mail to our new address in Arizona. The night before our departure, I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety that reminded me of the anticipation I had experienced before major life changes during my younger years. I was leaving behind the comfortable familiarity of my established life in Riverside, but I was also escaping from the institutional control that had been imposed on me against my will and contrary to my clearly expressed preferences. More importantly, I was joining with other women who had been similarly victimized by family members who had prioritized their own convenience over their elderly parents' rights and dignity. Together, we were going to build something better than what we had lost, and we were going to help other people escape from the kind of exploitation that we had experienced. On Saturday morning, we simply walked out of Golden Valley assisted, living and into the rest of our lives. The staff was too surprised to react quickly enough to stop us, and by the time they realized what was happening, we were already in the car that Dorothy had arranged to transport us to the airport. 6 months later, we had established the Senior Advocacy Network in Sedona, Arizona, operating out of a restored adobe building that served as both our offices and a meeting place for elderly people who were seeking support in challenging family decisions about their care and living arrangements. Carmen had used her nursing background to develop health advocacy services. Dorothy had created a financial consulting program that helped seniors protect their assets from family exploitation. Ruth had established a research and documentation service that helped people gather evidence for legal challenges to inappropriate institutional placements. And I had found my true calling as the organization's director and primary spokesperson, using the teaching skills I had developed over 30 years of education to help other people understand their rights and develop strategies for maintaining their independence despite family pressure and institutional bias. The Senior Advocacy Network had helped more than 200 elderly people regain control over their lives and living arrangements. We had successfully challenged dozens of inappropriate assisted living placements, prevented numerous cases of financial exploitation, and provided support services that allowed seniors to remain in their own homes, despite family concerns about their safety and independence. My children eventually discovered our location and attempted to challenge my decision to relocate to Arizona. But their legal efforts were unsuccessful because I had demonstrated my continued competence and had established a new life that was clearly fulfilling and meaningful. David Chen's legal work had also resulted in formal documentation that restricted their ability to make decisions on my behalf and confirmed my right to manage my own affairs without their interference. The house in Riverside was eventually sold, but the proceeds were transferred to accounts that I controlled rather than being managed by my children. I used part of the money to purchase a beautiful adobe home in Sedona where Carmen and I lived together, sharing household responsibilities and providing mutual support in ways that felt more like family than my relationships with my biological children had felt for years. Brian, Jess, and Kevin continued to believe that they had acted in my best interests, despite the evidence that their intervention had been based on their own assumptions and conveniences, rather than my actual needs or preferences. We maintained minimal contact through holiday cards and occasional emails, but the trust that had once characterized our relationships had been permanently damaged by their willingness to override my autonomy and treat me like an incompetent person who could not be trusted with decisions about her own life. The Senior Advocacy Network had become my legacy and my contribution to protecting other elderly people from the kind of exploitation and manipulation that I had experienced. We had created a model that was being replicated in other communities, and we had influenced policy changes that strengthened legal protections for seniors' rights and autonomy. On my 70th birthday, I celebrated with a party that included more than 50 people whose lives had been touched by our advocacy work. Carmen, Dorothy, and Ruth were there, along with dozens of seniors who had successfully maintained their independence with our assistance, attorneys who had worked with us on challenging cases, and community leaders who supported our mission. The celebration was held in the garden behind our office building, surrounded by the desert plants and red rock formations that had become my new definition of home. As I looked around at the faces of people who valued my intelligence, respected my experience, and supported my determination to live according to my own values and priorities, I realized that my children's attempt to control my life had inadvertently led me to discover my true purpose and my most meaningful relationships. They had tried to diminish me, but they had actually liberated me. They had attempted to limit my possibilities, but they had forced me to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed. They had wanted to manage my decline, but they had inadvertently triggered my transformation into someone far stronger and more influential than I had ever been during my years as a conventional wife and mother. The Mother's Day gift of a nursing home brochure had been intended to communicate their belief that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions about my own life. Instead, it had become the catalyst for the most empowering and meaningful chapter of my entire existence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.